Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Research Like a Pro question and answer series. Today, our question comes from a study group member, and it's about what to include in your research report, every search or just key findings. The question says, when writing our research report, do we go over everything we searched or just include things that really show that we met or didn't meet the objective? For example, I searched 3 different sources for a death record with no results. I reported on all of them in my research report. However, when looking for a birth record, I also searched 3 different sources and found the birth record on one of them, had a negative search on one of them, and found a duplicate of the first on the third. Do I need to talk about all 3 in the report or just write about the one that led to the discovered birth record? So let's talk about some of these different scenarios because it really does depend on your situation and your objective and the kind of report you're writing. So, scenario 1, let's say you find the best source. And the best would be an original or an image of an original. So, if you were able to locate the original source for the information you're seeking and you maybe found some databases that had derivatives and they led you to the original, you may or may not need to talk about anything but the original. It's optional if you had some negative searches in some databases, some derivatives and others, and then you found the original. It's really just up to you if you feel like you need to show those negative searches. So for an example, let's say you searched an ancestry database and didn't find everything. Then you search a different database at Family Search and you find an original source there. So you probably don't need to say that you searched it at Ancestry first. Another example is that maybe you searched all the databases and the birth record wasn't found at all online. So you had to order the original from the Vital Records office. In that case, you may want to mention, especially if it's for a client report, that you searched online first. And then since you couldn't get it anywhere online, then you needed to order it. And sometimes that means an additional cost to the client. So it's good to mention that. So depending on if it's a report to a client or not, then maybe it doesn't need to be just the original. You might want to include the negative search online. Your report obviously is going to focus on the original source. Even if you do mention it, the negative source, the negative search first, you're going to actually focus on the original source and what it reveals. So those negative online searches are optional. They may not be needed. If it's a client report, maybe. And then depending on your objective, sometimes if that record is really relevant to the objective, you might want to include all the negative searches you did before you found the record, because maybe you just had 5 things on your research plan and you want to show that you spent the time to do those first 4 things, even though they were all negative. And then the fifth thing you looked for, you got the information. So if like your objective is really specific, like wanting to find the birth information of a person, and the first 4 places you looked for that birth information were negative searches, you probably want to document all 4 of those, or else your report will be really short because you only found it on the 5th search. So depending on your research plan, how many things you searched, kind of what you want to show in the report, it really kind of depends. But if you do end up finding the best source, you are going to focus on transcribing that original source, what it reveals, and then it's really up to you if you need to show those other negative searches or online searches. So in another scenario, when you don't find the record, this is one where you do want to document all the negative searches. So especially document them in your research log. And then you probably do also want to show them in your report. This shows reasonably exhaustive research and it prevents duplicate work, especially for yourself in the future. And it can guide you for future research. Perhaps you will discover a new place to look for that information and you can see where you already looked. Also, it can become negative evidence if you put that into your report and you correlate everything together. While you're writing, you might realize that that negative search you did can be used as negative evidence pointing to someone leaving an area or dying or whatever it is. So an example of this is in my Sally Keaton report, the first phase. I was trying to figure out where Sally and her husband, William Reeves, lived in 1830. And so the first thing I did was try to find her marriage record to William. And I wasn't able to find her marriage record, so I did put into the report the negative searches I did for their marriage. And I felt like the marriage record was pretty key because it was really close to when they lived outside of South Carolina in 1830, as her father's estate packet said. So in my report, I had a section called Marriage Search for Sally Keaton and William Reeves, and I talked about the three places I looked. Um, First, in South Carolina, indexed marriages, and there were no matching results. And then footnote 20 shows South Carolina U.S. compiled marriage index, negative search for Sally Keaton at Ancestry. And then see also South Carolina marriages, negative search at Ancestry. And see also supplement to South Carolina marriages, negative search for Sally Keaton at Ancestry. See also South Carolina marriages, negative search at Family Search. So you can see that I kind of did an online search through several different databases. Then the next sentence is the book with marriage and death abstracts from the Pendleton Messenger newspaper was searched with no matching results. Tennessee marriage indexes were searched with no results. And 21 goes down to the Tennessee marriages that I searched. And I guess I forgot the footnote here for the book. I probably need to add that in. But I think I did talk about some of the marriages, and there were some obituaries that were talked about from this book, so it wouldn't be that difficult to go find that citation and add it here. I think I just forgot. So that kind of shows like a simple paragraph with 3 sentences showing different places that were searched for the marriage record, and then it wasn't found. And we know she moved from South Carolina to Tennessee around this time of 1830, and so that's why the marriage record might have helped to meet the objective. Since it was a key part of the objective, I felt like I needed this section. Then I also had a sentence and a paragraph for negative searches for the 1820 census in Pendleton District. So showing that they were not living in a place in 1820. I searched that 1820 census, and William Reeves was not living in Pendleton District, South Carolina. And then footnote 22 shows 1820 census, negative search for William Reeves in Pendleton District. And then the results that I found in Tennessee were that there were 6 people named William Reeves there, but it was obviously you can't tell which is which at this point so early in the research. So research moved on at that point. So this shows that with this marriage search being, even though it's a negative search, it was relevant to the objective, and I wanted to show that I had done that reasonably exhaustive research for their marriage record. Okay, in the Robert Daugherty report, this report I was trying to figure out the children of Robert Daugherty, and so I searched the 1800 census of North Carolina in Craven County, where he supposedly lived in the 1790s, and he wasn't found on that census. So I said Robert Daugherty was not found in the 1800 Craven County, North Carolina U.S. federal census. The only Daugherty heads of household in Craven were listed with their surnames spelled Dority, including Willis, Elizabeth, Richard, Owen, Ephraim, and William. And these could be Robert's half-siblings, and Ephraim may be his younger brother. Robert's absence from the 1800 census in Craven County is consistent with 3 deeds in March 1797 showing Robert sold land in Craven County and probably left soon after. So this is the case where I decided to include a negative search because it became negative evidence after I correlated everything, put it all together. And he wasn't ever found on the 1800 census because he moved to Kentucky and they don't have any extant federal censuses for that year. So it was helpful to be able to show that I did check the 1800 census, which would have showed us how many potential children he might have had in his household at that time, because that was the objective, but, couldn't find him there. And then the other one wasn't extant. So that's if you don't find anything, but sometimes you find something, but it's not exactly what you were looking for. And so this is scenario 3, the middle ground. And it's good to show due diligence and show that you're seeking the best evidence. So this is another case where you might want to include some of your negative findings. So when you find some people, but not others in the record set. So sometimes you might search for your person and you don't find anything, but then you find someone with the same last name who might be interesting and might be relevant, but you're not sure. You can report on those people you did find and then mention that your person wasn't found. And I kind of did that in this situation here where I mentioned the siblings, it could have been half siblings. And often people with the same surname are potential fan club members, friends, family, associates, and neighbors. So you can mention the negative search for your research subject and then the positive results for others with the same name or fan club members. Another time when you'd want to report your negative findings is when you find only derivatives or secondary sources. Derivative sources, or maybe it's a original source with secondary information, something about the source isn't perfect. You would still want to report on those negative searches. Um, and well, so I guess it's not a negative search. So it's a positive search where you found a derivative, and then maybe you couldn't find the original. So you report on that and you say, I had a negative search for the original of this birth certificate. I only found the derivative. So you found the transcription, but not the original certificate. So I would include both the positive and negative findings for that. And then when you find a similar type of record, so maybe you don't find a birth certificate, but you do find a delayed birth certificate. So in that case, you want to mention there was no original birth that was taken at the time of the birth, but you did find this other original source, but it was delayed and many years later. So the example for this is the Georgia Dawson example. And in this report, Diana was trying to identify Georgia Ann Lewis Dawson and her parents and siblings to see if they were connected to our Royston family. And the starting point is that Georgia's will mentioned her brother O.L. Lewis, her sisters Sarah, Mary, Savannah, and an unnamed eldest sister who had some daughters. And so first, Diana found this 1850 census showing Sarah, Mary, and Savannah, but not Georgia, living with their inferred parents, Noland and Martha Lewis. And so then she did some marriage searches to see if she could correlate what she was saying here and in the will with the marriage of some Lewis women to these men with the surnames Lawton and Buford. So she wrote in her report that she searched for marriages and found G.D. Royster marrying Mildred Lewis, John Dawson marrying Georgia, which is the research subject, and George Lawton marrying Mary Lewis. So some of these are positive results. So she found Mary, and she didn't find Sarah or Savannah, but she did find Georgia. So she found about half of these children's marriages. And the footnote goes down to Russell County, Alabama marriages. Then on the next page, she talks about the negative searches. No marriages were located for Sarah and Savannah Lewis, either in Alabama or Georgia marriage indexes. And footnote 9 goes down to the indexes she searched for Alabama and for Georgia at Ancestry. And so in this case, she found some records for some of the family and had negative searches for others. So it was good to include that she did search for these sisters, because if she had left this out and only showed the positive searches, maybe in the future she would have wondered, why didn't I find the other marriages? And she might have repeated that search. So it's good to include that you didn't find them and save yourself some time repeating the research. In the William Keaton report, the objective was to find the father of Lucinda Keaton, and William Keaton was the hypothesized father. And so this one is about searching for his will. And so the first thing that I did was, and this was in my research plan, was to search for the will of William Keaton in the Anderson County Will Book, Volume 1, that covered the time when he died, about 1830. And so he wasn't found in that will book, and footnote 7 shows a negative search for William Keaton and the Anderson County Record of Wills, Volume 1. And then I searched for South Carolina Anderson County estate case files, and this was a positive finding. So although it's not a will, it's a similar type of record, and it shows evidence that he died intestate. So it's really important to show both the negative search and the positive finding, because they go hand in hand to show that he had no will, and then he did have an estate file where he had letters of administration, and then we can figure out that he died intestate and that there isn't going to be a will, so we'll have to analyze the estate packet to find his children or heirs. So in this case, it was helpful to include both negative and positive findings. So really the question probably revolves around, do we always need to show everything we did? And often we don't need to include everything that we did, especially if we actually find the original source that we need. But in the cases where I showed that it did make sense to include some of those negative searches, when we did find something similar or something else that kind of replaced or added evidence to the negative search, it was helpful to include it. So just consider your audience, whether it's a client versus personal research. If it's a client, you'll want to show if you had to order something online, offline, if you searched already online. And then if you're preparing for future researchers, whether yourself or another person or a fellow researcher in your company, it can be helpful to show and document the negative searches that you did. But it is good to balance being really thorough with readability. And sometimes you can just list all those databases in the footnote, like I showed, for those South Carolina and Tennessee marriages. And then, of course, we always want to include negative searches in the research log. And then as you write the report, you can decide if you just want to check the research log for all the negative searches, or if you actually want to include them in a sentence in the report. So those are all options. So to wrap it up, if you have a failed search, report on everything so that you can show that you did reasonably exhaustive research for that source and didn't find it. If you do find the original source, focus on that find and consider many cases where you might need to include those negative findings before you got to the original, but often you don't need to. Then if you have success by only finding the derivative, show that you looked for the original and show that negative search, because you will probably eventually want to go find that original somewhere if you can. And just remember to consider, what would I want to know if I revisited this research? So hopefully that helps you to write your research report and keep researching like a pro.